My name is Gemma, and I'm 33 years old. I still remember the exact smell of that house, old wood, my mother's cooking, and something that always felt like safety. I grew up in that house. I scraped my knees on its porch steps. I cried into its walls during my teenage years. And then, when I was 27 years old, I started paying for it. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because there was a formal agreement or a signed document. I did it because my father had lost his job at the manufacturing plant after 22 years of service, and my mother's health had started declining in ways that were quiet but expensive. Prescriptions. Specialist visits. The kind of bills that don't announce themselves loudly, they just arrive and stay. My parents never said the word struggling out loud. They were too proud for that. But I could see it in the way my father stopped buying the newspaper he'd read every single morning for as long as I could remember. I could see it in the way my mother reused tea bags. Small things. Heartbreaking things. So I stepped in. I was working a corporate job in the city by then, living in a one-bedroom apartment I shared with a roommate to cut costs, and every month I transferred money home. First it was just a little, groceries, utilities. Then it became the mortgage payment. A full mortgage payment on a house I didn't live in, on a property that wasn't in my name, for parents who accepted my help without ever once sitting me down to say thank you in a way that felt real. I want to be honest about something right now because I think a lot of people in my position convince themselves of a story that isn't entirely true. I didn't help them because I expected something in return. I helped them because they were my parents and they were drowning and I was the only one swimming. My younger sister Rachel had married at 24, moved to a nicer neighborhood with her husband Daniel, and had what I can only describe as a carefully curated life. Dinner parties. Weekend brunches. A home decor budget. She contributed to our parents' lives in the way people contribute when they want credit without cost, birthday calls, holiday visits, the occasional gift basket. She was present in the way that photographs are present. Visible, but not real. For 6 years, I paid that mortgage. 6 years of skipping vacations I had earned, of driving a car that embarrassed me in parking lots, of saying maybe next year to every financial goal I had for myself. I didn't resent it, or at least I told myself I didn't. I had built a life that included this responsibility, and I had built it around love. The complicated, unglamorous, invisible kind of love that doesn't get celebrated anywhere. Then Rachel got engaged. The announcement came on a Sunday afternoon call. My mother was giddy in a way I hadn't heard in years. My father got on the phone too, which he almost never did. They talked about Daniel like he was a gift dropped from the sky, steady job, good family, the kind of man who will take care of her. I listened and I smiled and I said all the right things because that's what you do. I was happy for Rachel. Genuinely. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, her happiness didn't threaten me. The wedding was planned for the following spring. I helped with that too, not financially this time, but in the 100 other ways that women in families are expected to help without being asked. Venue research. Vendor calls. Sitting with my mother through 2 hours of cake tastings because Rachel was busy with work. And then, about 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me. Her voice had a strange quality to it, not excited, not sad, something in between. She said she and my father had been talking, and they wanted to do something special for Rachel and Daniel. Something meaningful. A real foundation for their marriage. I assumed she was going to ask me to chip in on a gift, a honeymoon contribution maybe. I was already calculating in my head. She told me they were giving Rachel the house. Not selling it to her. Not leaving it to her in a will. Giving it to her. As a wedding gift. The deed would be transferred before the ceremony so that Rachel and Daniel could begin their marriage as homeowners. My parents were going to move into a smaller rental nearby that they'd already found. They were excited about it, my mother said. Starting fresh. Giving their daughter something real. I didn't speak for a long time. My mother filled the silence by talking about how much space Rachel and Daniel would need, how they were thinking about children already, how the neighborhood was good and the schools were nearby. She talked as if she were describing a lovely plan that had nothing to do with me. As if the 6 years of my money that had kept that property from going into foreclosure were a detail too minor to mention. I finally asked her quietly, because I was raised to be quiet, whether she had thought about the fact that I had been paying their mortgage for 6 years. There was a pause. And then she said, "Gemma, we always appreciated that. But the house was always ours to give." That sentence rearranged something inside me permanently. I didn't cry on the phone. I said I understood, and I got off the call, and I sat in my apartment in the city, the small, modest apartment I had kept for 6 years because I was sending money home, and I felt something I had no name for. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like watching the ground shift beneath your feet and realizing you had been standing on something that was never as solid as you believed. The wedding happened. It was beautiful. I stood in a lavender bridesmaid dress and smiled in every photograph. And 2 months later, my parents called again. 2 months after Rachel and Daniel moved into the house I had quietly, faithfully, invisibly paid for across 6 years of my life. My parents called me on a Tuesday evening. My father spoke first, which was unusual. He had a way of letting my mother lead conversations that involved asking something of me, as if her voice softened the weight of the request. But this time it was him. And his tone had that particular texture I had learned to recognize since childhood, the one that meant he needed something and had already decided I would provide it. He told me they were struggling in the rental. The space was smaller than expected. The neighborhood was noisier. My mother's health made the stairs difficult. They had spoken to Rachel and Daniel about possibly moving into the new house with them, but Rachel had said, and my father paused here, choosing his words carefully, that it wasn't a good time. That they were still settling in. That they needed their space as a newly married couple. So they were calling me. I had a vacation home. A small property about 2 hours outside the city that I had purchased 4 years earlier. The single largest financial decision of my life. The thing I had saved for during years of sacrifice and careful living. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a porch that looked out over a tree line. I had fallen in love with the moment I saw it. I went there on long weekends when the city became too heavy. I went there alone, mostly, and I came back lighter. That property was not an investment strategy or a status symbol. It was the one place in my life that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. My father asked if they could move in. Not visit. Move in. Indefinitely. The silence that followed was different from the silence on the call about the house. That silence had been shock. This one was clarity. Something had finished forming inside me over those 2 months, some final, load-bearing understanding about the dynamic I had been living inside for most of my adult life. I had been the responsible one, the capable one, the one who could be leaned on because she had never once broken. And I had worn that role like it was my identity, not realizing until recently that it had been assigned to me, not chosen. I told my father no. I said it clearly. I said I loved them and I was sorry they were uncomfortable in the rental, but I could not give them my home. I said it without a long explanation, because I had learned by then that long explanations invite negotiation. A simple no, delivered with love, is harder to argue within a paragraph of reasoning. My father's voice changed. He said I was being selfish. He said that after everything they had done for me, raising me, sacrificing for me, giving me a foundation, this was how I showed my gratitude. He said Rachel had her own life to build, and it wasn't fair to burden a newly married couple, but I was single and established and could afford to be generous. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The daughter who had paid their mortgage for 6 years was being called selfish for declining to surrender her only personal property. The daughter who had received the house as a wedding gift 2 months ago was protected from burden because she was newly married. The logic wasn't hidden or subtle. It was stated plainly, without embarrassment, as if it made complete sense. I held my position. The call ended badly. Over the following week, my mother called 3 times. Each call was a variation of the same theme. I was breaking the family. I was being cold. I didn't understand how hard things were for them. I listened each time. I did not change my answer. I had spent 33 years being moved by guilt, and I was learning, slowly and at real cost, that guilt is not the same as truth. Then, on a Thursday night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I did, a police officer introduced himself and told me he was calling on behalf of a welfare complaint. My parents had contacted local authorities and reported that I had cut off contact with two elderly individuals who were dependent on me, and that I had left them in a situation of financial and emotional distress. They had described me as their caretaker. They had implied, without stating directly, that I had some legal or moral obligation I was refusing to fulfill. I cannot fully describe what it felt like to hear that. To understand that the people who raised me had picked up a phone and involved law enforcement not because they were in danger, but because I had said no to something they wanted. It was one of those moments where you see a person clearly for the first time, not as a monster, not as a villain, but as someone who has never once been told that you have limits. Someone who has treated your availability as a permanent resource rather than a choice you made out of love. The officer was kind. He asked a few questions. I explained the situation calmly, the mortgage payments, the house transfer, the vacation home request, the timeline. He listened without interrupting. At the end, he told me that no law had been broken, that I had no legal obligation to house my parents, and that the complaint would be noted but required no action. He apologized for the inconvenience. He sounded like he had heard versions of this story before. After I hung up, I sat on the floor of my apartment for a long time. Not crying, just thinking about the version of this story my parents were telling themselves, where I was the ungrateful daughter, the selfish one, the one who turned her back on family. And about the version that was true, where a woman had spent the better part of her 20s funding a life for people who, when the time came, chose to give that life to someone else and then expected her to keep giving anyway. I called Rachel that weekend. It was the first real conversation we had in months. I didn't call to accuse her. I called because she was still my sister, and because I needed to say certain things out loud to someone who had been inside the same story. She was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she said something I didn't expect. She said she hadn't known I had been paying the mortgage for 6 years. She said our parents had told her the house had been paid off years ago. She said she felt sick. I believed her. I still believe her. We talked for almost 2 hours that night. About the roles we had been placed in since childhood, her as the one who needed protecting, me as the one who did the protecting. About how those assignments had shaped every decision both of us had made. About how neither of us had ever really questioned them until now. Rachel and Daniel are still in the house. I don't begrudge her that anymore. She didn't engineer what happened. She was handed something and she accepted it, the way most people accept things that are offered to them without asking too many questions about the cost to someone else. That's human. I understand it. My parents eventually found a solution that didn't involve me, a smaller ground floor apartment, some assistance from a local program for seniors, a recalibration of what they needed versus what they wanted. They're fine. Not in the way they wanted to be fine, but fine. My vacation home still stands. I was there last month on a Saturday morning, coffee on the porch, looking out at those trees. It was quiet in the specific way that only places you have truly earned can be quiet. I thought about every transfer I had made, every vacation I had skipped, every version of myself I had delayed in the name of being responsible for other people's lives. And I thought about the word no. How small it is. How long it took me to use it. How much of my life had been shaped by my inability to say it to the people I loved most, because I had confused love with availability and sacrifice with virtue. I'm 33 years old. I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am, for the first time in my adult life, building something that belongs entirely to me financially, emotionally, structurally. I am learning that loving your family and protecting yourself are not opposing choices. That you can grieve what a relationship is while still choosing not to be consumed by it. That the version of you who finally says enough is not a failure. She is, if anything, long overdue. If any part of my story sounds like your story, if you have been the one who gives without being asked, who holds things together while others move forward, who waits for acknowledgement that never quite comes, I want you to know that you are not alone. And I want you to know that it is not too late to change the terms.